On a crisp, overcast morning in late November 1980, an exploration drilling crew operating on a lake basin in southwestern Ontario noticed their heavy rotary bit had abruptly seized in bedrock. A crew of 12 seasoned roughnecks spent 2.5 grueling hours pulling torque, attempting to free the drill string from whatever was gripping it hundreds of meters below the lake bed, but the stem refused to budge. Then, a sharp sequence of deep metallic pops vibrated through the steel deck, and the entire rig began listing toward the water. Realizing the platform was losing structural footing, the workers scrambled into evacuation boats and raced for the nearby shoreline. Roughly 90 minutes later, standing on the frost-dusted bank, they watched in disbelief as a towering steel drilling derrick slid soundlessly beneath the waves of a shallow lake that averaged barely 3 meters in depth. The collapse did not end with the rig. Within minutes, the calm water transformed into a violent, expanding vortex that began dragging in everything adrift across the surface. Tugboats, heavy transport barges, and timber work docks were torn from their moorings and pulled toward the center of the breach. A local angler out on the water was heard shouting that the lake bed had ruptured beneath him as he desperately gunned his outboard motor toward solid ground. Across an area spanning roughly 5 square kilometers, the entire volume of the lake vanished in less than 3 hours, draining like an unplugged reservoir basin. The catastrophic suction pulled 20 hectares of surrounding crown land, shoreline forest, and road infrastructure down into the abyss. Decades later, when environmental scientists descended to sample the altered hydrology, they discovered living organisms that by all conventional biology had no business surviving there. To understand what swallowed that lake, one must examine the ancient geology of the Great Lakes Sedimentary Basin. Over 380 million years ago, during the Devonian and Silurian periods, a vast, restricted inland sea covered much of what is now southern Ontario and the Michigan Basin. As that shallow sea repeatedly evaporated under arid conditions, it laid down massive halite and evaporite beds hundreds of meters thick, known today as the Salina Formation. Over the subsequent epochs, glacial deposits, shale, and carbonate mudstones buried the salt under crushing weight. Halite has a rock density of approximately 2.16 grams per cubic centimeter and remains entirely incompressible. As overlying glacial tills and sedimentary strata compacted under geological pressure, the dense upper rock strata became heavier than the buoyant salt layers below. In response, subterranean salt beds flow under tectonic stress like dense glacial ice, migrating upward through faults to form massive domes and anticline structures beneath the regional topography. This unique geology created a commercial convergence. Because solid halite is completely impermeable, hydrocarbon reserves migrating through the basin become trapped against the flanks of these salt structures, making them prime targets for provincial oil and gas exploration licenses. Furthermore, the thick halite beds themselves represent premier industrial deposits for dry rock salt extraction. Beneath this single lake basin, 2 heavy industrial operations were actively working the same geological footprint: a conventional energy exploration venture drilling from surface waters, and an extensive room and pillar rock salt mine operating roughly 450 meters directly underneath. The mechanical error that initiated the disaster took less than a minute. What followed reshaped the regional geography for the next century. When the exploratory drill bit breached the ceiling of the active underground salt workings, the initial opening was a modest 35 centimeters in diameter. But under the immense hydrostatic head of a massive lake, fresh water immediately surged down the borehole into the void. The moment fresh water contacts halite, aggressive chemical dissolution occurs. Each cubic meter of water dissolved over 300 kilograms of salt as it cascaded downward. The small bore rapidly dissolved into a wide conduit, then collapsed into a massive crater, unleashing the largest accidental aquatic vortex ever recorded in Canadian inland waters. The lake handed over every liter of water it possessed with terrifying mechanical force. In the nearby shipping canal, connecting the basin to the regional waterways of the Great Lakes shipping corridor, An industrial tugboat fought desperately against the sudden upstream pull. The pilot pushed the diesel engines to maximum reverse thrust, but the powerful reverse current overpowered the vessel, forcing the crew to abandon ship, leap onto the rocky embankment, and watch helplessly as their tug was sucked backward into the maelstrom. 11 heavy bulk cargo barges followed in rapid succession, tipping vertical before vanishing below. Moments later, the commercial loading docks, a public boat launch, paved parking facilities, and a substantial tract of shoreline woodlot, replete with mature maple and spruce stands, slumped laterally into the widening sinkhole. In total, roughly 13 billion liters of fresh water evacuated into the subterranean salt workings. Under standard conditions, fresh water dissolves approximately 360 grams of sodium chloride per liter before reaching full saturation. Because of this aggressive chemical hunger, the underground salt mine stood absolutely no chance of surviving intact. As the cavernous mine corridors flooded, an adjacent high-pressure natural gas transmission pipeline sheared under the shifting bedrock, triggering an explosive subterranean fire that forced Transport Canada and regional aviation authorities to establish an emergency no-fly zone across the entire county. Then came the hydrologic inversion that stunned local engineers. The drainage canal, which had historically drained southward toward the lower Great Lakes Basin, reversed its flow entirely. Vast torrents of deeper, mineralized lake water began surging backward through the channel to fill the sudden terrestrial vacuum. Where this reversed current tumbled over the rim of the newly formed crater, it created a temporary waterfall over 50 meters high, momentarily forming the tallest cascading cataract in the entire province. As water slammed into the deepest extraction shafts, compressed air pockets trapped inside the mine labyrinth erupted back up through exploratory wells and vents, launching towering geysers of mud, foam, and gas hundreds of meters into the autumn sky. When the hydraulic equilibrium finally stabilized, a tranquil freshwater body that had previously averaged 3 meters in depth was permanently transformed into a steep-walled, brackish aquatic trench dropping over 60 meters down. It instantly became one of the deepest inland water bodies in southern Ontario. Along the drowned periphery, the brick chimney of a submerged lakeshore cottage still breaks the surface like a lonely stone monument to the old shoreline. To grasp why a 35-centimeter drill hole brought down millions of tons of overhead bedrock, one must examine how underground rock salt is engineered. In conventional room and pillar mining, heavy machinery cuts cavernous halls out of the halite deposit while leaving massive square pillars of solid salt behind to support the overlying strata. This structural grid can endure safely for well over a century under dry conditions. However, the moment millions of liters of undersaturated fresh water pour in, those load-bearing pillars are made of the exact substance the floodwaters are chemically dissolving. The mine was not merely inundated, its internal skeleton was digested from the inside out within hours. The most chilling aspect of the incident lies in the timeline. The exploratory drill bit seized early in the morning, yet the platform did not start to tilt until 2.5 hours later. That 150-minute gap represents the entire human and industrial tragedy. For 2.5 hours, 12 drillers stood on the derrick deck, diagnosing a mechanical stall, entirely unaware that hundreds of meters below them, a subterranean torrent was carving out the foundations beneath their feet. Not a single person on the surface had been provided with the updated subsurface maps, showing active extraction galleries intersecting that mining lease block. What prevented mass casualties that morning was a single underground tradesperson acting with total clarity. 55 salt miners were on shift deep inside the extraction galleries when water first breached the perimeter. The emergency evacuation was triggered by an underground maintenance electrician who spotted water trickling across a haulage drift where water had never flowed before, and he pulled the master alarm immediately without waiting for supervisory confirmation. All 55 workers were hoisted to surface levels in a single crowded cage before the power failed. On the surface, the drilling crew stepped safely onto support skiffs just as the platform tilted, and the lone recreational angler made it safely ashore. Miraculously, The only recorded fatalities were 3 working yard dogs left on the industrial docks. Days later, after subterranean air pressure stabilized and hydraulic equilibrium returned to the flooded mine, 9 of the 11 sunken steel barges shot back to the water's surface like corks, buoyed by trapped air. Then began the protracted legal and regulatory warfare across Canadian courts. The petroleum operator claimed the mining corporation had failed to publish accurate plans showing the lateral extent of its active working leases. The mining firm countered that the exploration team had relied on flawed coordinate projections and botched their borehole surveying before spudding the well into a designated mineral lease. Provincial resource regulators and the Ministry of Natural Resources could never definitively resolve the precise point of failure, because all physical evidence, the severed drill stem, the broken pillars, and the survey markers, lay entombed under dozens of meters of flooded, collapsed tunnels. A major botanical nursery and heritage lakeside estate that lost over 24 hectares of prime shoreline into the abyss launched a landmark civil action, ultimately securing a $12 million settlement. The energy exploration firm was held primarily liable by the courts and ordered to pay approximately $45 million in damages to the mining company. Yet despite tens of millions exchanged in corporate liability settlements, the mine ceased operations permanently, throwing hundreds of local unionized miners out of work with zero long-term compensation. The fate of the aquatic ecosystem was equally devastating. In the span of a single afternoon, the water chemistry shifted from pristine, low-salinity freshwater to a dense, mineral-heavy brackish state that wiped out the native freshwater fish populations. Hundreds of thousands of northern pike, walleye, yellow perch, and smallmouth bass were either swept down into the flooded shafts or killed by the abrupt osmotic shock. Over the following seasons, Euryhaline and invasive species migrating through connecting canal systems colonized the altered basin. What swims in those deep, dark waters today is not a rehabilitated native fishery, but an entirely alienated biological regime born of industrial failure. This vulnerability extends far beyond a single historic accident. Across the country, energy corporations and utility operators utilize hollowed-out subterranean salt caverns within similar formations for strategic hydrocarbon storage. Thick halite beds offer exceptional containment properties. Impermeable crystalline salt prevents gas migration, and cavern storage space can be hollowed out economically by solution mining, injecting pressurized fresh water down a casing and extracting saturated brine back up. In nearby subbasins beneath southwestern Ontario and across western Canadian salt basins, energy companies store massive volumes of compressed natural gas and liquid hydrocarbons inside deep solution caverns. Yet whenever operators propose expanding these solution mine storage complexes, local municipalities and First Nations communities voice fierce opposition. Developing and maintaining each storage cavern consumes millions of liters of fresh water, drawn directly from local municipal aquifers that provide the sole source of regional drinking water. And this vulnerability is not confined to the distant past. In the spring of 2012, rural residents living above a commercial salt cavern storage field near the shores of Lake Huron began reporting strange gas bubbling up through local wetlands, drainage ditches, and creek beds. Within weeks, homeowners felt mysterious low-frequency tremors shaking their foundations at night. For months, residents lodged urgent complaints with municipal reeves and provincial ministries, only for a regional inspector to dismiss the phenomenon, suggesting the noise and vibrations were simply heavy gravel transport trucks hauling along the nearby provincial highway. On an early August morning, the community woke to an overwhelming stench of heavy industrial hydrocarbons and diesel fumes, strong enough to trigger severe headaches. By sunrise, a massive sinkhole had swallowed several hectares of forested wetland between adjacent cedar swamps. Fully grown tamarack and pine trees sank upright into the liquefied earth, sliding down into a boiling slurry of water and crude condensate. The structural containment wall of an industrial brine cavern had breached, allowing overlying bedrock and glacial drift to collapse into the void, which vented volatile hydrocarbons along the flanks of the formation up into the atmosphere. Over 300 rural residents were subjected to long-term mandatory evacuation orders that stretched on for years. The sinkhole opened as a 1-hectare slump. Within 6 years, it had expanded into a 14-hectare industrial exclusion zone. One displaced resident bitterly suggested that the Provincial Inspection Office should be invited back to find where their imaginary transport truck had parked. The historic method for extracting deep mineral resources from these evaporite formations, the legendary Frosch process, relied on pumping superheated pressurized water down a well to melt underlying native sulfur veins, then forcing the molten mineral to the surface using compressed air. It was a brute force industrial method that forever weakened the surrounding rock mechanics. Across Canadian resource registries, hundreds of deep storage and extraction caverns remain catalogued. When regulatory engineers conducted comprehensive geological stability reviews, dozens were found to be encroaching perilously close to the outer structural margins of their host halite beds. Several sit less than 30 meters from the formation perimeter, while dozens more operate within a narrow buffer of 90 meters. That 90-meter safety zone is not an immutable law of geophysics. It is merely an administrative calculation of how much solid halite is required between a high-pressure cavern of hydrocarbons and the outside environment. Which brings us back to the unexpected discovery inside the altered lake water. New biological discoveries typically occur in deep northern boreal peatlands or beneath Arctic ice sheets. This one occurred in an ordinary southern Canadian recreational lake. Following the drainage disaster and subsequent mineral inflow, the salinity of the deepest stagnant layers surged toward 32%, nearly 9 times the mineral concentration of standard ocean water. When limnologists sampled the deep brine layers, they discovered unique halophilic microorganisms thriving far beyond the normal salinity limits of typical aquatic microbes, whose biological threshold rarely exceeds 18%. The explanation uncovers a remarkable prehistoric timeline. When halite crystals precipitated out of evaporating Paleozoic seas hundreds of millions of years ago, they sealed microscopic fluid inclusions inside their crystal lattices. Archaea and ancient extremophiles trapped within those subterranean fluid pockets enter a state of cryptobiosis, shutting down metabolic processes completely for geological epochs, not dead, but suspended in time. Peer-reviewed research confirms viable microscopic organisms recovered from ancient Silurian salt strata hundreds of millions of years old. The working scientific consensus is that modern microbes did not colonize the lake at all. When the cavern flooded and ancient halite dissolved, microorganisms that had remained dormant since before the arrival of vascular land plants woke up in a Canadian lake basin because an exploratory drilling contractor miscalculated a coordinate boundary. The deep earth continues to provide clear notice. A rotary drill that stops dead for 150 minutes, or gas venting into a wetland for months. When structural cave-ins occurred at neighboring salt operations, safety inspectors had already filed dozens of regulatory notices detailing compromised roof bolts, unmonitored equipment, and faulty emergency stops. Every warning was an explicit preview of an impending disaster. The subterranean ground beneath our feet is rarely as solid as we assume, especially when we push deeper than our mapping can verify.